Never thought I'd be the one standing at my daughter's graveside, holding a folded program with her face on it, trying to remember how to breathe. Claire was 34 years old. She had her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and she had built something real, a medical imaging company she'd started from nothing in her late 20s, right out of her MBA program. By the time she died, Clearview Diagnostics had contracts with 7 hospital networks across the Southeast. The accountant told me, at the reading of the will, that her estate was valued at just over $4 million. I didn't know that number when I was standing at her grave. I just knew she was gone. The call came on a Tuesday. Her husband Nolan phoned me at 6:40 in the morning. I remember the time because I just poured my first cup of coffee and the light was still gray outside my kitchen window. He said there'd been an accident. He said Claire had been driving back from a conference in Savannah and her car had gone off Route 17 near the marsh. He said she was gone before the paramedics arrived. I sat down on the floor of my kitchen. I don't know how long I stayed there. The service was held 6 days later at Calvary Presbyterian, the church where Claire had been baptized, where I'd walked her down the aisle 7 years before. It was a closed casket. The accident had been severe, Nolan told me. The casket was pale oak, simple, the way Claire would have wanted it. She hated fuss. I sat in the front pew next to my wife, Lorraine, and across the aisle from Nolan. He wore a dark suit and a measured expression, and he accepted condolences the way a man signs documents, efficiently, without real feeling. I noticed that at the time, but I told myself grief looks different on different people. I told myself I was not being fair to him. There were maybe 200 people there, colleagues from the company, hospital administrators she'd worked with, old friends from college. The pastor spoke about Claire's faith and her drive and her generosity. Then Nolan's friend, a man named Beckett, who I'd met maybe twice at family dinners, stood up to give a eulogy. Beckett was a few years younger than Nolan. Good-looking in an obvious way, the kind of man who knows it. He'd always been friendly at those dinners in a way that felt slightly too warm, like a salesman who'd done a weekend course on building rapport. He stood at the podium and said, Claire had been a light, that she'd changed Nolan's life, that some people come into this world and leave it better than they found it, and that Claire was one of those people. He paused for effect and looked out at the congregation with an expression that was trying very hard to be grief. I was staring at my hands. Lorraine was crying softly beside me, and then, from just behind me, came a sound. It was quiet, barely audible. But in the silence of that church, in the pause after Beckett's words, it cut through everything. A short, low sound, almost like a cough, but not a cough. A laugh. I turned around. The pew directly behind me was empty. We'd asked for that row to be kept for family, and some cousins hadn't made it down from Ohio. There was no one there. I turned back. My heart was going fast in a way that had nothing to do with grief. I looked at the casket. The pale oak sat still and silent under the flower arrangements. I told myself it was the building settling. Old churches do that. I told myself the acoustics had played a trick on me. I told myself a lot of things in the 3 seconds after I heard that sound. But I knew what a laugh sounded like, and I knew what Claire's laugh sounded like. I didn't say anything to Lorraine. I sat through the rest of the service with that sound living inside my chest like a splinter. At the reception afterward, I found Nolan standing near the windows with a plate of food he wasn't eating, and I asked him about Claire's personal things. She'd had a storage unit she'd been renting since before they were married. She kept old business files there, some furniture from her first apartment, things that mattered to her before Nolan was part of her life. I'd helped her move those boxes years ago, and she'd always said she'd clean it out eventually. Nolan's face did something small and quick before he answered. "I'll take care of all of that," he said. I told him I didn't mind helping, that it would give me something to do with my hands. He said it wasn't necessary, that he'd already spoken to Claire's attorney and that there were some procedural things that had to happen first before anyone could go through her property. He said it with a kind of casual authority, like he was telling me the parking situation at a restaurant. I nodded and walked away and stood by the coffee urn and thought about the storage unit and about the sound I'd heard in the church. The attorney's name was Hargrove, and he called me 2 days later. He was handling Claire's estate and wanted to schedule a meeting. Standard procedure, he said. I asked him, while I had him on the phone, whether there were any legal restrictions on accessing Claire's storage unit. He paused. Not that I'm aware of, he said carefully. Why do you ask? I told him what Nolan had said. Another pause. Longer this time. I'd suggest coming in sooner rather than later, he said. I went the next morning. Hargrove was a compact, precise man in his 60s who had been practicing estate law in Charleston for over 30 years. He laid out the basics of Claire's will, clearly and without editorializing. The house she and Nolan shared would go to Nolan as joint property. But the business, Clearview Diagnostics, was structured differently. Claire had established it as a sole member LLC before her marriage, and per her will, controlling interest was to be transferred into a trust. The trust's primary beneficiary was a pediatric oncology foundation she'd cared about for years. Nolan would receive a buyout of his marital share, calculated at the time of her death. Nolan had not been told the specific details yet. That meeting was scheduled for the following week. I asked Hargrove whether Claire had seemed concerned about anything in the months before her death, whether she'd made any changes to her documents recently. He looked at me over his reading glasses for a moment. She came in 8 weeks ago, he said. She updated the trust documentation. She also left a sealed letter, to be opened only in the event that her death was ruled accidental and occurred within 1 year of that meeting. He slid an envelope across the desk. My name was on it in Claire's handwriting. I opened it in my car, in the parking garage, with the engine running and my hands not entirely steady. Dad, she wrote, if you're reading this, then something happened and it happened the way I was afraid it might. I need you to know a few things, and I need you to know a few things, and I need you to know them before Nolan does. I've been watching him for 6 months. I know what he and Beckett have been doing. I know about the money. And I know I can't prove any of it yet, not on paper. But you always told me the truth finds daylight eventually. Help it find daylight. Start with the storage unit. The code is the year I was born backward. That was all. I sat in that parking garage for a long time. Claire had been born in 1990. The code was 0991. I drove directly to the storage facility on the north side of town. The woman at the front desk recognized me. I'd been there with Claire before and didn't question why I was there. I signed the visitor log and walked to Unit 214 and punched in the code, and the lock clicked open. The unit was organized the way Claire organized everything, meticulously with labels. Filing boxes along the right wall, older furniture stacked on the left. In the center, on a folding table, was a single banker's box with a yellow sticky note on top. The note said, "Start here." I lifted the lid. Inside were printed bank statements. Emails Claire had apparently printed from her personal computer, a thumb drive, and a legal pad with 3 pages of her handwriting. The handwriting was smaller and tighter than her usual style. The handwriting of someone who'd been frightened for a while. I sat down on an old dining chair, and I read. Over the preceding 18 months, Nolan had been referring Clearview's equipment leasing contracts to a shell company called Meridian Asset Partners. On paper, Meridian appeared to be a legitimate commercial leasing outfit. In reality, according to Claire's notes and the bank statements she'd pulled, Beckett was the registered agent for Meridian's parent LLC in Delaware. Nolan was not listed anywhere, but Claire had traced the payments. $340,000 moved through Meridian in 14 months. And she'd found a joint brokerage account held under Beckett's name and a woman she didn't recognize where the money was landing. She discovered it because she reviewed every contract over $10,000 personally. That was the kind of businesswoman she was. She'd noticed the Meridian invoices were always just under that threshold. She'd been building the file for 6 months. She'd been planning to take it to her attorney and then to law enforcement. She'd been waiting until she had enough that it couldn't be explained away. She never got there. I took the box. I took all of it. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table and called my son-in-law's cell phone. He picked up on the second ring, and I asked him if he'd like to get dinner, just the two of us, that it would help me to talk about Claire with someone who loved her too. He said yes without hesitating. I watched him across the table at the restaurant for 2 hours. He ordered the expensive scotch. He talked about Claire in the past tense with a fluency that bothered me, not because he was holding back emotion, but because he seemed practiced, like someone who'd already moved through a door and pulled it shut behind them. He mentioned Beckett 3 times. He said Beckett had been a tremendous support. He said Beckett had helped him think through some of the business questions that were going to need to be resolved over the coming months. I asked, in a way that I kept very casual, what he meant by business questions. He said he was hoping to sell his interest in Clearview quickly and cleanly. He said it would be too painful to stay involved with something that reminded him of Claire every day. I said I understood. I went home and called my brother, Warren, who had spent 22 years with the FBI before he retired to Myrtle Beach. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You need to go to the NTSB first," he said. "The accident investigation. If there was any tampering with that car, they'd have evidence. The question is whether they were looking for it." He told me who to call. I called the following morning. The investigator I reached was a woman named Forsyth, who'd handled the Route 17 accident. She was professionally non-committal until I told her I had financial documentation suggesting my daughter had discovered a fraud scheme carried out by her husband in the weeks before her death, and that my daughter had expressed concern for her safety in a letter written 8 weeks prior. The line was quiet for a moment. "Sir," she said, "I'd like to ask you to come in." The next 2 weeks moved in a way I can only describe as the sensation of standing very still while the ground shifts under you. I went about my days. I ate, I slept poorly, I called Lorraine every evening, but underneath all of it was this constant hum of forward motion that I wasn't entirely controlling anymore. The NTSB investigator contacted the South Carolina Highway Patrol, who contacted SLED, the State Law Enforcement Division. They pulled the vehicle inspection report and requested the car itself, which was still in an impound yard waiting on an insurance determination. A specialist in accident reconstruction looked at the steering assembly. The brake line had been compromised, not catastrophically, not in a way that would have been obvious to a casual inspection, but in a way that, over a drive of 80 or 90 miles, would progressively fail. Nolan had driven Claire to the conference in Savannah. He'd flown home alone 2 days early, citing a meeting. Claire had driven back herself. Beckett's phone records placed him in the parking garage of Claire's hotel in Savannah the evening before she left. The thumb drive Claire had left in the storage unit contained something I hadn't realized when I first looked through the box: a screen recording. She'd used software on her laptop to record a video call. On that call, which had taken place 10 days before her death, Nolan and Beckett discussed what would happen once the business was in Nolan's control. They discussed a number. They discussed timeline. At one point, Nolan said something that I've thought about every single day since I first heard it. Sitting at my kitchen table with the thumb drive plugged into my laptop and the house very quiet around me, he said, "She's not going to see it coming. She trusts me completely. That's always been her problem." Lorraine was the one who found me after I'd listened to it. She said she came downstairs for a glass of water and found me sitting at the table with my face in my hands. She didn't ask me what I'd heard. She just sat down next to me and put her hand on my arm and stayed there. That's been her way for 37 years. I gave everything to the investigators. The box, the thumb drive, the letter. I gave them the name of Hargrove, the attorney. I gave them the name of the brokerage account. I gave them the timeline Claire had reconstructed in her own handwriting on those 3 pages of legal pad. The arrests happened on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the funeral. I found out because Forsyth called me. She said she wanted me to hear it from her before it was on the news. She said both men had been taken into custody. She said the charges included first-degree murder, conspiracy, wire fraud, and several counts related to the financial scheme. I was standing in my backyard when she called. It was early November, and the air was sharp, and the leaves had mostly come down, and the yard looked bare and clean in the morning light. I said thank you. I said it more than once. "Your daughter did most of the work," Forsyth said. "You just made sure it got to the right people." Nolan went to trial the following spring. His defense team argued that the vehicle evidence was inconclusive and that the screen recording had been taken out of context. The jury did not agree. They deliberated for 11 hours. He was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Beckett took a plea before trial. He provided testimony against Nolan in exchange for a reduced sentence. He will serve a minimum of 22 years. The Meridian money, what could be recovered, was returned to Clearview's accounts and ultimately folded into the Pediatric Oncology Trust Claire had designated in her will. I sat on the phone with the foundation director for about an hour when she called to tell me the transfer had cleared. She told me what the money would fund: a research position, 3 years of a clinical trial, a family support program. She said Claire's name would be on the door of a room in the new pediatric wing at MUN USC. I told her that sounded exactly right. There are things I still think about in the quiet hours. I think about the sound I heard in that church, That brief, low sound from behind me while Beckett was at the podium, and I have my own explanation for it now. I think it was old wood or air in the pipes or some ordinary thing that grief makes extraordinary. But some part of me will always hear it as Claire. I think it was her telling me to pay attention. I think she knew I was sitting in that pew feeling helpless, and she needed me to stop feeling that way. She was always better at that than me, better at pushing through, better at seeing past the surface of things. I still drive past the church sometimes. I don't stop. I just drive past, and I think about that Tuesday morning when the light was still gray and the coffee had just been poured and everything was about to change. I think about what it means to love someone so completely that you can't protect them, and what it means to be their father anyway, and what you do with that when the worst has already happened. You do what she would have done. You follow the paperwork. You make the calls. You stay at the table long past midnight if that's what it takes. You find the daylight. That's what she asked me to do, and that is the only thing in all of this that I am certain I got right. People ask me sometimes how I held it together. The honest answer is that I didn't, not completely. There were nights during those 6 weeks between the funeral and the arrests when I sat in Claire's old bedroom. We'd kept it mostly the same since she left for college, and I just stayed there in the dark without turning on a light. Not praying, not thinking in any organized way, just sitting with the weight of it. What I've come to understand looking back at all of it is that the truth doesn't need your help to exist. It already exists. It's already there in the documents, in the phone records, in the wear pattern on a brake line. What it needs is someone willing to go looking for it instead of accepting the version they were handed. Nolan and Beckett were counting on grief to do their work for them. They were counting on a father being too broken to ask questions. They had seen other people in other situations go quiet when the loss was big enough, and they assumed I would do the same. That was their miscalculation. And it didn't come from any particular strength in me. I want to be clear about that. It came from Claire. She laid the path before I even knew I needed one. She had the intelligence to see what was happening around her, the discipline to document it carefully over months, and the courage to make a plan even when she must have been frightened. She did all of that alone, and she trusted me to finish it. That trust is what kept me moving on the mornings when I would rather have stayed in that dark room. There's something I think about when I consider what Nolan and Beckett actually believed they were doing. They thought they were being clever. They thought the gap between what they knew and what everyone else could see was a kind of protection, and for a while it was. But that gap has a way of collapsing. It collapses because clever people leave traces, they can't help it. The same intelligence that designs the scheme also generates the evidence, and it collapses because the people they underestimate have resources those people never bothered to account for. Claire had built a company from nothing by the time she was 30. She reviewed every contract over $10,000 herself. She knew exactly how Meridian's invoices were structured because she'd spent years learning to read exactly that kind of document. They stole from her using a system she understood better than they did. She just needed time to prove it. The hardest thing about this, even now, is that she deserved more time. But here is what I hold on to. The foundation received the money. Her name is on a door at a children's hospital. The work she cared about is continuing because of the structure she built and the fight she started. That's not a consolation. It doesn't fill anything. But it is real. And real things matter when everything else feels like it's dissolving. I am not the same man. I was the morning Nolan called me. I don't think I'll ever fully be. But I am the father of a woman who, even when she was afraid, chose to be meticulous and brave and thorough rather than simply hope for the best. If I can keep doing that, staying at the table, following the thread, refusing the easier version of events, then I think I'm carrying forward the right part of her. That's enough. It has to be enough. And most days it actually is.